Recording in progress.
करुणावारी है मीरांबिके, करुणावारी है मीरांबिके, करुणावारी है मीरांबिके। अनवरत झरती है झर झर, अनवरत झरती झर झर झर। तू हमसे कहती हृदय में अपने, मेरी प्रेम सुधा रस भर भर भर, मेरी प्रेम सुधा रस भर भर भर। करुणावारी है मीरांबिके, करुणावारी है मीरांबिके। मम हृदय पात्र अति लघु, माँ इसे विशाल बना। मम हृदय पात्र अति लघु, माँ इसे विशाल बना। तू अमृत सुधा देने को खड़ी, तू अमृत सुधा देने को खड़ी। हम अज्ञान वश करते मना, हम तेरी संतान ज्ञानी। माँ हमें तू मार्ग दिखा, हम तेरी संतान ज्ञानी। माँ हमें तू मार्ग दिखा, कैसे ग्रहण करे यहाँ प्रेम सुधा। पात्र यंत्र का पाठ सिखा, कैसे ग्रहण करे यहाँ प्रेम सुधा। पात्र यंत्र का पाठ सिखा, पात्र यंत्र का पाठ सिखा। माँ हमें वह पाठ सिखा। करुणावारी है मीरांबिके, करुणावारी है मीरांबिके। अनवरत झरती झर झर झर, तू हमसे कहती हृदय में अपने, मेरी प्रेम सुधा रस भर भर भर, मेरी प्रेम सुधा रस भर भर भर। करुणावारी है मीरांबिके, करुणावारी है मीरांबिके, करुणावारी है मीरांबिके माँ।
Namaste, my dear brothers and sisters. The love and blessings of the Mother and Sri Aurobindo to all of you from Sri Aurobindo Ashram Delhi branch. This song was about Karuna, compassion, and it glorifies the compassionate aspect of the Divine Mother. And that is something that we all depend upon, because without that compassion, it would be difficult to justify our existence. It should not be possible to make much progress on the path, on the spiritual path. And it is both, therefore, a necessity and also a product that should emerge from our being under the divine influence, becoming more and more compassionate. Today's session is an introduction to anatomy and physiology. Yesterday it was introduction to the course. Today it is introduction to anatomy and physiology. On Monday it will be introduction to health sciences. And when we go to the systems, the initial few minutes will be an introduction to that system. Why am I so fond of introductions? To explain that, I'll give you one of my first experiences in class 9, when I started a serious study of science subjects. Before that, I was studying a bit of everything in school, including history and geography. And I did not like those subjects, history and geography, because there was so much of facts to be remembered. And I thought, once I go to class 9 and the number of subjects becomes fewer, I'll have the choice of the subjects. I'll choose science, and I'll no longer have to remember anything. Science will be exciting. And in that youthful, phase when you overestimate your abilities, I also thought that I'll make some discoveries in science. So it'll be a very exciting thing to do compared to remembering all the facts which have to be mugged up in history and geography. But then one of the first experiences in class 9, when I had those fewer subjects and I got to study science in detail, one of the first experiences was that the teacher who had to teach us science came and hardly said a word and immediately turned to the blackboard and wrote down on it potassium K, sodium Na, hydrogen H, oxygen O, carbon C, and carbon dioxide CO2, and water H2O, and so on. A large number of symbols and formulae he filled the board with. And he said, by the time you come for the next class, you should have remembered all this. I thought, is this science? Once again, these facts have to be remembered. And the result was that it was so much out of tune with my personality that I failed the first 3 class tests in science. And then I thought something has to be done about it. And then, the divine grace, it guides your steps. I went to the school library, picked up one by one a few books on science written by Western authors. And all what I did was to read in those books the preface and the introductory chapter. And once I did that, I said, yes, my ideas of science were perfect. Science can be an extremely exciting subject. Nothing needs to be remembered. It can be understood. It can be rationalized. These people don't know how to teach science. So I studied science my way, and it worked. And I once again started doing well in the exams. So that's why I'm fond of introductions, because the introduction was completely missing in those classes. And so we get introduced to anatomy and physiology today. Now, anatomy is the study of the structure of the body, generally the structure in health, and physiology, similarly, the function of the healthy body. But then there's no strict dividing line between health and disease. It's deviations from health that we call disease. And therefore, there's no really a strict dividing line, and we'll not keep that line as we study anatomy and physiology. The relationship between anatomy and physiology, one can say, is like that between history and geography. Anatomy is geography, the scene of action, and physiology is history. That is what actually happens. So once again, history and geography, the subjects that I detested, but in a different context. So that is what anatomy and physiology are like. And again, like sister disciplines, there is often an undercurrent of rivalry between those who specialize in anatomy and physiology. And the anatomists sometimes come and tell you in the class that the really important thing which you will use in medicine is anatomy, and a bit of physiology that you need, we will also teach you. And all the other superfluous details that the physiologist will tell you will not be of any use when you go to the clinical years. And similarly, the physiologists tell us that physiology is the basis of medicine. This is what you will find really useful in the clinical years. And what the anatomists tell you is superfluous detail. The bit of anatomy that is really necessary, even we will teach you while teaching physiology. So that is sort of the type of rivalry, at least I observed in some of our teachers who started teaching us anatomy and physiology. but then there's a grain of truth in both. But I ended up choosing physiology, but once again, because anatomy would have required remembering quite a bit of facts the way history and geography did. Physiology didn't seem to need much of that, and I was happy that I did that. Now, let's turn to the proper subject. Now, it is common knowledge that our body is made up of a large number of cells, a few trillion cells. But life evolved on the planet not as we are, but in the form of very simple single-celled organisms. Now, firstly, how did we get this term cell? This term cell was coined by Robert Hooke in the 17th century. He had invented a microscope. And, like suppose you go back to your childhood, you discovered a piece of colored glass. You would try to look at everything through that colored glass and get excited. Oh, such and such thing, it's supposed to red glass. Oh, the sky looks red instead of blue, and so on and so forth. So, you experiment with all types of objects, how they look through that red colored glass. So he had invented a microscope. He was also excited, and he wanted to see how different things look under it. And he would be thrilled to see, oh, it looks so big. And when it looks so big, it's so different. So in that process, once he put a slice of a cork under the microscope, and he found that it was made up of a large number of small compartments, one next to the other, polygonal compartments fitting very nicely with each other. And he said, oh, it is made up of so many little tiny compartments, and he called those compartments a cell. It took another 200 years for one botanist and one zoologist, Schleiden and Schwann, the two of them, who found that, in fact, all animals and plants are also made up of compartments of the type that he had observed in the cork. In the cork, they were dead, but here, these were living dynamic structures, and they worked out some of the details, and once again, retained that same term cell to describe these structural, functional, and developmental units of plants and animals. So that is how we got the term cell. Now, what I'll do is I'll start with the single-celled organism, and you'll understand why I'm doing that, the relevance of it very soon, why I'm doing that. Now, a prototype of a single cell is an amoeba. No fixed shape, just one cell constitutes the organism, and like all cells, it has a nucleus, which is the controlling center. And how does it live? By getting energy. And where does it get its energy from? It gets its energy from food. Now, getting energy from food is very similar to the process by which we get energy by burning fuel. Say, if we take wood or any other fuel and we burn it, it uses oxygen from the air. Say, fuel plus oxygen gives us energy, the heat energy, plus carbon dioxide, plus water. Now, something similar happens. The food is the fuel. It uses oxygen in the living organism, gives us the energy which keeps the animal alive, and carbon dioxide is treated as a waste product. But then you say that the process is similar. We don't burn like wood. We don't burn because in the body there are mechanisms for tapping that energy in very small installments, bit by bit, so that they can be used for bodily processes, and only a small fraction is dissipated as heat. And that is why the body gets a little warm, but it does not catch fire. And that's why when an organism dies, one of the first things that happens is that the body becomes cold, because that heat is no longer being generated in the body. Now let's come to this amoeba and see what it does. It is surrounded by water on all sides. So here's the water. And even this tiny organism has the sense to spot food. And suppose it spots some food nearby. So this is something which it can utilize as food. It can sense it. And then what does it do? It starts changing its shape. And it extends, these processes like this. And gradually starts closing in on this. And the result is that now this food is not really outside, it is now inside. So it spreads its arms around and then closes in on them. And it's a sort of a lethal hug if it happens to be something living. And then, within this amoeba, there are structures which contain digestive enzymes. So this balloon which contains the food and this balloon which contains the digestive enzymes, they move closer to each other, fuse. And then the digestive enzymes in this digest this food. And then this food is released outside, it's available to the organism. But then to be able to use this food, it needs oxygen. Now there's dissolved oxygen in the water which surrounds it. So this oxygen is picked up from here. So food is there, oxygen is there, and it produces energy which keeps the organism alive. And then it also produces some carbon dioxide, which then is thrown out into the seawater. So the basic functions of eating, digestion, and producing energy by using oxygen and throwing out the waste products, it's able to do. Not only that, if it senses danger, then in the same way, just as it moves closer to the food, it can move away from the food. It can change its shape and move rapidly away from the danger. That also it can do. Now, so you can see that, and also if it has to multiply, it just grows. The nucleus divides into two identical nuclei, and then there's a division between the two portions. So each portion gets one nucleus, and you have two organisms from one, each identical to each other. You can't make out which was the parent and which is the child, but the animal has reproduced all right. So you can see more or less all the functions that we identify with the life are available even in this tiny organism. But then while it is a wonderful machine that has been created, it has certain requirements. And the requirements are that it should have food available, it should have oxygen available in its surroundings, and it should be able to get rid of the waste products, not only carbon dioxide, but food will also have some proteins, and that may generate some ammonia. So that also it should be able to get rid of. And the water that is surrounding it should be neither too cold nor too hot, because if it is too cold, all the chemical reactions will slow down, and at a very low temperature, they'll stop. And if the temperature is high, say more than 42 or 43 degrees centigrade, then the proteins in the organism will degenerate and the organism will not be able to live. Not only that, the surrounding water should have a certain amount of what we may call saltiness. That is not too much salt, not too little of salt, and a particular kind of salts. So that is also important. And it should have a certain level of acidity and alkalinity. So all these things are important: availability of food, availability of oxygen, availability of possibility of getting rid of waste, and the surroundings should be wet and warm, and they should have a certain acidity and alkalinity, which we call pH, and not too low, not too high a pH, and the saltiness should also be of a certain level. So this organism, it can function only when these conditions are made available, and they are easy because one little amoeba, if it takes a little bit of food, what difference does it make? Plenty of food will be still available in the sea. One little amoeba, if it throws a bit of carbon dioxide or ammonia into the water, what difference will it make? This sea will still remain more or less unchanged. And the temperature, the water, as you would have observed, remains more or less at the same temperature, and a large body of water like a sea or an ocean remains at more or less the same temperature throughout the year. So the temperature is quite constant, and again the composition by and large remains constant. So providing these conditions under which the amoeba can live are quite easy. But then we are not single-celled, and we don't live in water, we live in air. So the situation is quite different. So what do we do in this type of a situation? How do we live? We find that, say, if we draw for sake of simplicity, not a few trillion cells, but just 3 cells, what you find that in case of complex organisms like man, we live in air, but then a little bit of fluid is there surrounding each cell. And this fluid has a composition which is very similar to seawater. And its saltiness, you can feel saltiness as well as warmth. When a person cries, the tears are warm and salty. If we get a wound and if we lick the blood from that wound, that is again warm and salty. So that reminds us of our origins. And we are also, each cell in our body is also surrounded by a bit of fluid, which very closely resembles seawater. And once again, this surrounding seawater has food which can enter this. The surrounding fluid has a dissolved oxygen which can enter the cell, and the carbon dioxide and waste products can be thrown into this fluid. So each cell is not in the sea or the ocean, but it has a private pond of its own. But then here there's a problem, because in the case of the sea and the ocean, taking a little bit away or dumping a little bit into it hardly made any difference. When the amount of fluid is very little, very soon all the food available in this fluid will be exhausted, all the oxygen will be exhausted, and carbon dioxide and waste will build up to toxic levels, levels which are poisonous for the cell. Now, this has been solved by nature by doing something else, and that is very close to every cell of the body are these tubes, which have food oxygen. And so the food and oxygen move from this fluid into this fluid, and from this fluid to this cell, and oxygen also moved from the fluid in this tube into this fluid surrounding the cell and into the cell, and the waste products move from this cell into this fluid and from this fluid into this tube. Now, this doesn't really solve the problem. It postpones it a bit, because what will happen is very soon all the food in this tube will also be exhausted, the oxygen will be exhausted, and the waste products will build up to toxic levels. So how has that problem been solved? That problem has been solved by keeping this fluid in motion. It's not stationary, it keeps moving. And the motive force for this comes from the heart. So the fluid is kept in motion by the heart pumping the blood into these tubes, and these tubes at that level, which is very close to the cells, is what we call capillaries. And as the fluid flows out, I've given it a different color because now it is a little poorer in food and oxygen, and it has additional carbon dioxide and waste products, and this then returns to the heart. Now, this seems to make the problem a little easier, but once again, it's a postponement, because even if it keeps recirculating like this again and again, soon there will come a point where all the food available will be exhausted, all the oxygen will be exhausted, and the waste products will again build up to toxic levels. So this will not keep the organism alive. Now, where does this food and oxygen ultimately have to come from? And where does this carbon dioxide and waste to be eventually eliminated? In our own surroundings. That is the air, from which we can get oxygen, food which we get from our plate, and carbon dioxide again has to go into the air. And so it is the environment by which we are surrounded. It's our own surroundings outside us, from where the food and oxygen have to come, and into which the waste has to be dumped. And that will be the ultimate solution to this difficulty. And that is done in different parts of the body. Therefore, what is necessary is that there should be some parts of the body where the outside environment can come in close contact with the internal environment. Internal environment means the fluid that is surrounding each individual cell, that little private pond. That is the internal environment. So it should come in close contact with that so that an exchange can take place. And whatever is required can be taken from the external environment, and what is not needed can be dumped into it. And that happens, different aspects of that happen in different parts of the body. See, if we take the lungs, if you look at the structure of the lung, then this is one tiny little unit. We have millions of these in each lung, which is called the air sac. So this is the ultimate unit where this exchange takes place. And how does that happen? That happens because very close to this is one of those tubes that we were talking about. And in case of the lungs, the arrangement is such that the blood that flows into these capillaries is the one which has given up its oxygen and food, and has picked up waste products. Now, the air sacs are eventually in contact with the airways, and the airways are in contact with the air, and the air that we breathe in has some oxygen, and this oxygen eventually reaches here, and here there is a very lining of very thin cells, and the cells in the capillary, this tube is a capillary, are also very thin, and this junction has the ability, has the capacity to transfer this oxygen across this into this tube, and the carbon dioxide can move in the opposite direction and eventually get breathed out into the air. So you'll see that what is actually happening is that even in this little air sac, we have a sample of the external environment, the air, which reaches here, and that comes in close contact with the fluid in this capillary, which is we can call the internal environment of the body, because this is in equilibrium with the fluid that is surrounding each cell in the body. So they come in close contact, and so the external environment is brought in close contact with the internal environment, and exchange can take place. The oxygen can move in from here into this fluid. The waste product, carbon dioxide, can move out like this. So the result is that the fluid that comes out of this tube in the lungs has more oxygen and less carbon dioxide. So some oxygen has been gained, some carbon dioxide has been lost in this process, and the result is that oxygen has been replenished, and now this can be used by the whole body. Carbon dioxide has been lost, and therefore nowhere will it build up to toxic levels. Now let's look at another structure. Say the intestine. Anyway, it doesn't matter. You can see this. What I'm trying to draw is why I'm trying to show fat is that this is the wall of the intestine. So this is the wall, and here is the cavity or the hollow space there. Now, through this wall of the intestine, once again, there is a blood vessel passing. And in the intestine, we have some food available, which has been digested. And this food can get transferred from here. There is an arrangement by which it can get transferred to this blood. And the result is that the food that the blood that comes out of the intestine has a little more food than the blood that entered. Now, once again, you find that the external environment, this cavity in the intestine is the external environment. It looks inside the body, but in fact, strictly speaking, it's still outside the body, because started with the mouth, and from the mouth, there's a tube continuing, and this is in continuation, therefore, with the outside, from the plate to the mouth, from the mouth into this cavity. And if this transfer does not take place, eventually it will again go out of the body. So while it is here, it is still outside the body essentially. But then this food in the external environment is being brought in close contact with the internal environment here. And the result is that this arrangement is there for this transfer. The result is that the food gets transferred from the external to the internal environment. This food is picked up. Now it will circulate all over the body and provide that food, so that the food will never get completely depleted. It keeps getting replenished periodically. Okay, so this is the way we can look at what is happening in the intestines. Now, like all other parts of the body, the intestinal cells are also using food, but not all of it that has been picked up. They are also using oxygen that is coming here because the lungs have been replenishing it. And this also should not have too much of carbon dioxide. It does not have too much carbon dioxide because the lungs have removed it. But then as the food goes out, the blood goes out, the blood that is going out from here is different from what happens in other parts of the body. In other parts of the body, the food is depleted because that part of the body uses up the food. Here, instead, the opposite is happening. The blood that goes out has more food than the blood that entered. So, as a result of this exchange between the external environment and the internal environment of the body, the food is made available to the whole body. Now, let's look at one more part of the body before we go further. And that is the kidney. Now, in the kidney, if we look at the smallest unit that we have, and take a small part of it, we find that here there's an arrangement for the blood to enter and go out. And this blood, once again, comes in close contact with this. Both these have thin-walled cells. These are thin membranes. And across this, filtration can take place. And eventually, what is filtered, after some modifications, will find its way into the urine. A lot of processing takes place, but eventually it finds its way in the urine, and urine goes out into the external environment. So, in other words, once the fluid has entered the urinary tract and processed, it is essentially outside the body. And the result is that from the inside of the body, because of this arrangement where the dividing line is extremely thin, a transfer can take place from the internal to the external and waste products thrown into the external environment. So you can see that the body is like the human society, where each person is doing something specialized, and that is contributing to the convenience and survival of the rest. In turn, each person is also dependent upon others for its own survival or convenience. For example, a teacher is only teaching, which is an important function, but then for his food, he is dependent on the farmer. And the farmer, in turn, if he has to educate his children, it's dependent on the teacher. And if he wants to get clothes, the farmer is also dependent on the tailor. So, there is this interdependence, and that is true. So the food that the intestine picks up is not only for the intestine, it's for the whole body. And in the same way, the oxygen that the lungs pick up is not only for the lungs, it's for the whole body. So each is making use of what the other parts of the body are doing and contributing to some aspect of survival of the whole body. So that is how the functions have been taken care of, in spite of our being multicellular, and in spite of the fact that we don't live in water, we live in air. Now, so we have talked about some of the major systems like the blood, the heart, the blood vessels, the lungs, the intestines, and the kidneys. But that is not all that there is in the body. There are others. So how do the other systems contribute to maintaining the surroundings of the cells at a constant level? That is, at such a level that food is always available, oxygen is always available, waste products don't accumulate there, the temperature is maintained. Now, how are the other systems contributing to this process? Now, when you have a complex system, one of the things that is required is coordination. And this function of coordination is necessary because the conditions inside the body do not remain constant. It's not that each part of the body just keeps doing its job and then all is taken care of, and there's no question of any disturbance. There are disturbances which are inevitable. For example, suppose you are in a desert where the temperature outside is 50. The temperature will have a tendency to go up. It will not stay at the temperature of 37, which is the temperature at which the cells can function properly. Once it goes beyond 42, 43, the proteins will degenerate. And therefore, we don't have to let that happen. In fact, it stays very close to 37 all the time. We go to a place which is freezing temperature, once again, it stays at 37. Now, how is this type of challenges? How is it that in spite of this type of challenges, the constancy is maintained? It's because of the coordinating system, and that coordination is brought about by the nervous system and the endocrine system. So these are the coordinating systems of the body. They are the functioning as the coordinators. So that is their role comes in. But there are other systems too. For example, the bones and the muscles. Now the bones and the muscles not only give shape to the body, they also make movement possible. And that's again important because the amoeba has to move to find its food. The amoeba has to move to be able to escape from danger. But then animals, including human beings, also have to do the same. No society can support more than a very limited number of paralyzed people. So we all have to move to be able to get our food, if not escape from dangerous animals, but all the same, there are different types of dangers that we also face. So movement is necessary for survival, even for human beings, and of course, all the animals. Now, therefore, we need bones and muscles. And if the animal cannot live, then there's no question of, there's no value in just maintaining the constancy of the fluid that surrounds each cell of the body. So movement is necessary for that. Before the food can be transferred from the intestines to the blood, first the food has to be available in the plate. And for that, the organism has to move, whether it is to catch a prey in case of a wild animal or to go to the market to get some food. Either way, the person has to move. The animal has to move. Movement is essential. And then you find that there's a great deal of conservation of mechanisms. And amoeba moves, we also move. We move with both the amoeba and we move with the help of contractile proteins. That is, proteins within the cell, which can change their shape and thereby change the shape of the cell or the organism, make it contract or shrink. And the type of contractile proteins that an amoeba has are remarkably similar to the type of contractile proteins that we have in our muscles. So many of the physiological and biochemical mechanisms have been conserved so well because they could not be improved upon vastly. There are small modifications to suit the purpose, but there's a remarkable similarity in the physiological and biochemical mechanisms. The mechanisms by which the amoeba is able to tap its energy from food in small installments so that it doesn't burn are very similar to the mechanisms that we have in our body for tapping that energy in small installments. And the way the amoeba moves to catch its food and engulfs it, many cells in our immune system do exactly the same to engulf the foreign bodies and germs that enter our body. So all these mechanisms which you find in an amoeba are there even in our body. The only thing is they have been adapted for the type of structure we have, trillions of cells and living in air instead of water. But essentially, the mechanisms have been conserved in terms of structure as well as function. There is a great deal of conservation of these mechanisms. And therefore, we are not really as different from an amoeba as we may think. Now, by and large, we have talked about most of the systems of the body except one, and that is the reproductive system. Now, strictly speaking, the reproductive system does not contribute to maintaining the constancy of the fluid that surrounds each cell of the body. But it does contribute to perpetuating the species, because although we are a wonderfully made machine, the machine has a limited existence. It cannot last forever. And therefore, the survival of the species as a whole depends upon at least a large number of in the population leaving behind some progeny who start life from the beginning once more. And therefore, reproduction is again important, because what use it would be to have all the mechanisms of survival if they were to end with just one generation. It's the continuation of life from generation to generation through reproduction that keeps the species alive. So more or less, I think we have talked about, and of course, for the defense, I referred to the type of cells which we have, which like an amoeba engulf the germs. So we have the immune system, which defends us from various types of challenges around us. So by and large, we've talked about all. So we've seen that every system, directly or indirectly, is making a contribution to something which is essential for survival. And what is essential for survival in us is not really very different from what is essential for survival in a single-celled organism like the amoeba. And the requirements basically remain. Food should be available, oxygen should be available, and there should be a mechanism for dumping waste so that it does not accumulate in the immediate surroundings of the cells. And the fluid surrounding the cells should neither get too cold nor too hot. It should have a certain amount of saltiness, should not get too salty or have very little of salt. It should have a certain amount of acidity and alkalinity that should remain more or less constant. So all this is achieved, and achieved in spite of the challenges we have, like say being exposed to high temperature or high altitude, or being exposed to germs, or taking exercise when we use up much more oxygen and produce much more carbon dioxide, or immediately after a meal when we dump a large amount of fuel into the body, and when between meals, when we are not providing any fresh supply of food, we go on a fast for 1 week, we don't supply any food, still the food remains available to all cells of the body. So in spite of all these challenges, the fluid that surrounds each cell of the body remains at a constant level, and at a level which is compatible with life. So all this is achieved through one system of the body or the other. And this meeting these challenges and still maintaining this constancy is essentially the function of the nervous system and the endocrine system and the immune system of the body. So we have been able to see what all these systems are doing by way of making a contribution to the survival. Now that we have seen that basically we are like any other single-celled organism, although there's a great deal of complexity that has been introduced and that has been handled by nature in a particular way, but the essential requirements remain the same. Let's have a little closer look at a cell. Now the cell is surrounded by a membrane. Now the cell membrane is not just a covering, it is again an active and dynamic structure, and it has the structure of like a sandwich, it has a 2 layers of fat. See, these are fatty substances. See, this is the membrane. Throughout the membrane is like this, but then we all have outside these proteins. So it's basically a membrane is a lipoprotein structure that is a lipid bilayers and the proteins coating it. And there are some proteins which transverse the entire membrane, run throughout the membrane, and a bit is exposed outside. So this type of proteins are also there, but this is a structure that not only defends the cell, but also makes selective transmission of substances across the membrane in keeping with the requirements of the cell, and to remain keep it in compatible with the requirements of the cell. It has specialized areas which can couple with the regulatory substances like the hormones, so that the hormone can have the desired effect in the cell. So this covering is not just a simple covering. This itself is a dynamic structure. Then, we have structures the way we have in amoeba, which can digest. We call them the lysosomes. And there are structures where the energy is released in small installments. The arrangement is that whatever energy the food produces is released in small installments to the body. These are the mitochondria. These are the powerhouses in the cell. And these are, in fact, remarkably similar to some of the germs. And there is a school of thought which believes that in the early stages of evolution, these germs got incorporated inside the cells of more complex organisms, and both are useful to each other. This germ now doesn't have to look for food elsewhere. It's always available in the cell. And in the same way, the cell can get energy in small pockets instead of getting all the energy at a time. So it's a symbiotic relationship. So in fact, it is the germs which have continued inside. And the evidence in favor is that apart from this, these mitochondria also have a little bit of DNA, which means the type of substance which is necessary for all organisms to be able to regulate their function. And in human beings also, there's a mitochondrial DNA. And the interesting thing is that we get half of our genes from the father and half from the mother. But since the father's cell is very small and it's mainly the mother's egg, which is the big cell, all the mitochondrial DNA that we have in our cells comes from our mothers, not from the father. Okay. Anyway, just a little interesting aside. Then, we have ribosomes. That is the seat, the platform on which proteins are synthesized. And then, of course, we have the nucleus, which has all the genetic material. And this genetic material is placed on these structures, which under certain circumstances show up as threads. And we have a fixed number of chromosomes, a fixed type of chromosomes in each organism. In human beings, we have 23 pairs of these chromosomes, and they have the DNA, which in turn determines the type of proteins we will make, and which in turn determines the structure and function of the cell. So the blueprint for what a cell will look like is there in this, and the blueprint for how an individual will grow from a single cell to a properly shaped organism is also there in this. And you can imagine the degree of miniaturization and the complexity which is packed into this, and how this can grow into a whole organism from the egg once it has been fertilized, is something which again makes you marvel at the complexity and the accuracy of the process, because occasionally when something goes wrong and a child has some little abnormality, like say a limb missing or something, or a little hole in the heart, we say, oh, something has gone wrong. But the surprising thing is that things go wrong so rarely. Most of the time, this blueprint is so perfect that we get a perfect child, in spite of this level of miniaturization of the whole process. But then you'll say, if every cell in the body has the same type of nucleus and the same type of chromosomes, how is it that a liver cell is different from an intestinal cell, and an intestinal cell is different from cells in the lungs and different in the brain? That is because this has all the information, but all this information does not have to be expressed. Only a small fraction is expressed. The rest remains repressed, or you can say hidden. So once again, like the consciousness, we don't manifest all the supreme consciousness of the creator. We manifest a little bit of it. Each cell in the body also manifests only a little bit of the potential of the chromosomes in the nucleus. The rest is not expressed. And that's how these cells look from each other. So how a cell looks and behaves depends upon the fraction of the genes on these chromosomes that have been expressed in that cell. That makes them look different and function differently. And when that is deranged, then we may get cells which have the same type of material in the nucleus, but do not behave well. They multiply too fast. They are not differentiated enough to be able to perform any function. And these are the cells we call cancer cells. They multiply much more rapidly than they need to, and they are not well differentiated. So once again, it's a normal mechanism gone awry, and that is what can lead to a cancer. Now, this shape of each cell and the way it functions depends a lot on the type of function it has to perform. For example, a muscle cell has to contract and shrink, and therefore a muscle cell is elongated like this. In the same way, a nerve cell has to carry messages across long distances, and therefore it also needs processes. And we find that it has processes of two types. And of course, the different nerve cells would be very vastly different from each other. But this is how a typical nerve cell looks like. Now, here is the nucleus. Now, these are the processes which bring information. And this is the process that takes away information. And this is what distributes that information. So these are the dendrites. This is the axon. And we'll come to all these again. But so you can see that the shape is adapted to the cell. And there are cells which store fat. Now, if you look at these cells, much of the cell is full of fat. The nucleus pushed to one side. So this is the nucleus, not in the center. And the rest of the cell is one big globule containing fat. And when you stain these cells in a particular way and see them under the microscope, you find that there is no fat here. They are empty. The fat has been dissolved by the process to which that tissue was exposed in the process of making it ready for being seen under the microscope. Of course, there are some chemicals which can stain this fat, and then you can see the fat also. But in normal staining, you find that this whole thing is empty. Why I'm telling all this is because our professor of anatomy used to crack a joke. He said, there's no fat here, but it tells you once upon a time there was fat. And that is why a poet once said, Khandar bata rahe hain, imarat buland thi. The ruins are telling us that once upon a time, there was a magnificent monument here. And why did the poet say that? He said that when he was talking to his wife who had now grown old, and he was sort of comparing it to the ruins and saying, once upon a time, it reminds me of the type of beautiful girl you once upon a time were. So, Khandar bata rahe hain, imarat buland thi. The ruins are telling the story of the monument that lived once upon a time. So, you are telling me the story of the beauty that you once had. In the same way, these empty little vacuoles are telling us that once upon a time there was fat inside. So, each cell has a different, you can see a vastly different shape, and it is able to perform the type of function. But still, what is common to all these is that there is a nucleus, except, of course, there are some cells in the body which don't even have a nucleus, but then they have a limited life, and that is for a limited purpose. But by and large, all the cells have this nucleus, and they have the same requirement. They have to be surrounded by a fluid which has a food supply and oxygen supply, and into which the cell can dump its waste products. That requirement remains constant no matter what type of cell we are dealing with. Now, the cells are organized in groups, and these groups of cells are what we call tissues. So, cell is the primary sort of level of organization, but the grouping of cells is in the tissues, and depending upon the function, the cells that constitute the tissue are different. For example, if there is a lining or a covering, then those cells will be of a different type. And then depending upon what type of lining it is. For example, if it is the lining of the intestinal cells, it will have little processes here so that the surface area can multiply. On the other hand, if these are cells which are lining capillaries, which is carrying blood across which exchange has to take place, then these will be very thin cells. And the same would be true of the cells in the air sacs where oxygen and carbon dioxide have to pass through. So these lining tissues, which we call epithelia, will be of different types. On the other hand, if it is a type of a place where something has to be produced and provided, then they'll have that secretory apparatus, and they'll be lined in such a way that they can put their secretion here, which then can be sent out. So there can be a glandular epithelium. In case of the urinary bladder, it is arranged in such a way that the size can shrink and expand. So without tearing the lining, still the bladder is able to expand and shrink. So we have different types of tissues depending upon the requirement. These are the covering tissues. But then there are tissues which don't have to cover, they are inside. For example, these tissues which have to contract and shrink, the muscular tissue, or tissues which have to transmit messages, like the neural tissue. So you have different types of tissues depending upon. So what basically a tissue is a group of cells which have a similar function and similar origin, and they perform a particular type of function. Now, the next level of organization is a number of tissues grouping together to form organs. See, the stomach is an organ. Now, the stomach has to produce digestive juices, so it will have glandular tissue for producing the digestive juice. The stomach also has to contract and shrink, and therefore it will have muscular tissue. And the stomach also has to receive its blood supply, so it will also have vascular tissue within its walls. That type of blood vessels, that type of tissues we have in the blood vessels. So all these different types of tissues come together in a part of the body so that part can do its function, and that is what we call an organ. Like the stomach is an organ, the lungs are an organ, the kidneys is an organ, the brain is an organ. So these are organs. They are a collection of different types of tissues, because every organ cannot have just one type of tissue. It at least needs blood to be brought. It may have some nerves inside it to regulate its function, and so on. So each organ is a collection of different types of tissues. Then the next level of organization is the systems. Say the stomach does one type of functions. The stomach is an organ, but then all the digestive function is not performed by the stomach. Some of it is just, some part of the system is involved in just conveying the food from the mouth to the stomach, like say the food pipe, and some parts in receiving what has been digested in the stomach and digesting it further, like the small intestine, and some parts which will take care of the undigested and indigestible food so that it can be eliminated. That is the large intestine. So the food pipe, the stomach, the small intestine, and the large intestine together would form the digestive system. So that is the level of systems. So this is how we have these different levels of organizations: cells, tissues, organs, and systems. Okay. Now let's change gears a bit now and see how, in spite of challenges from outside, the conditions under which each cell of the body lives are maintained constant. Because that is the basic goal of all parts of the body, to keep this surroundings of each cell at the level to which they have got accustomed long time back in single-celled organisms. And those are the conditions which continue to be necessary even in complex organisms like man. So how is it that is kept constant? For that, we saw that there's a coordinating system. Now let's see what are the basic requirements of the coordinating system. The coordinating system should first have an ability to sense the type of changes that have taken place or are likely to take place. For example, if a person is going to an area, say at high altitude, where the air pressure is low and therefore the oxygen pressure is low, there should be an ability to sense that the oxygen pressure has now fallen and therefore something should be done about it. The person has gone to a very cold place, one should be able to find out the temperature is far below 37, which is my body temperature. So something should be done about it to maintain this. So there should be something which should be able to sense it. Or say one has started taking exercise, the person is using too much of oxygen, producing very little of, using too much oxygen, producing more carbon dioxide than normal. So there should be a way to increase the oxygen supply and increase the rate at which carbon dioxide is eliminated from the body. So there should be first a sensing system. This will be an important part of the coordinating system. Now, the input about the disturbance that has taken place or may take place comes not only from one source, it could come from multiple sources. Even if it comes from one source, you still need a processing unit, which can process this information from one source or multiple sources and decide what should be done, and then convey this decision to the appropriate organs. For example, suppose the person has gone to a very hot place and the information has been conveyed to this processing unit. Then after processing, this unit comes to the conclusion that one of the things that the person should be doing is to sweat more, which means that there should be a way of conveying this decision to the organs which will be able to have that action. That is, it should be conveyed to the sweat glands in the skin. Which means that a coordinating system is essentially a communication system. Picks up information of one type, processes it, and then conveys the information to another type of organs or systems. So this is essentially what a control system or regulatory system is about. These are the essential characteristics of a control system. And it is through this type of mechanisms that we are able to maintain the surroundings of each cell relatively constant, in spite of all the challenges that we face from outside as well as from within the body. But these conditions have to be maintained relatively constant, otherwise the cells will not be able to survive. And if the cells of the body don't survive, we don't survive. And these conditions are very similar to the type of conditions under which single-celled organisms learned to live. Now, the importance of this constancy of the fluid surrounding each cell of the body was first appreciated by a 19th century physiologist, Claude Bernard, a French physiologist, who called it the constancy of the milieu interieur. Milieu interieur, in French means the internal environment. Now, why did he call it the internal environment? It is internal because it is inside the body. And why is it environment? Because it surrounds the cells. What surrounds or what is around is the environment. And whose environment? This environment of each cell of the body. Now, that is what has to be maintained constant. But at the same time, he called it internal because it is within the body. So within the body, each cell has an environment, and this environment has to be kept constant. Now, these things were further elaborated by an early 20th century physiologist in the United States. His name was Walter Cannon. And Walter Cannon coined another term, homeostasis. Now, homeostasis means, homeo means the same, and stasis means condition. That is, the condition remains the same. Condition of what? Condition of the fluid surrounding each cell of the body. So these two terms, homeostasis and constancy of the internal environment, you'll find used very frequently in the subsequent sessions. And they are important, as you can see, because that is what our survival depends upon. I think it is time to now stop for questions, because that should not be just a formality, and attention span is also limited. And therefore, instead of continuing any further, we'll stop here and continue further in the next session. Questions?
When are we going to start with the practical sessions? Because this is a lot in detail. It's good, but then for a normal human being, it's too much to take in one session. Probably I'll see the video again, part by part,
Well, you raised two different issues. One is when the practicals will be, that is the yoga asanas and pranayamas. They'll be once a week on Thursdays. And about too much in one session, that I'm quite sort of conscious of, and that's why we have long gaps in the sense that you have classes on Monday, Tuesday, and Friday. So that leaves another 4 days on which there's no theory class. And at the same time, as I stopped a little before time today, we'll keep doing that. And there'll be quite a bit of recapitulation and repetition in the sessions to come. So by the end of this, you'll find that you'll understand the human body quite well.
Is one example what makes some people more prone to infections? Is there something that we can be more aware of?
Yes. That's a good question. What makes some people more prone to infections is essentially their immunity levels. The immune system is not as competent as in those who can resist these infections, because we are all exposed to the infection. But we don't become aware of it till there are symptoms. So if there are symptoms, then we say that this person is getting repeated, say, attacks of common cold. So this person is more prone to respiratory tract infections. What makes this person more prone is the low immunity levels. And therefore, the next question that arises is how is it that we can strengthen our immune system? And to that, the answer is simple. Basically, three things. A healthy, balanced diet, about which we talked in great detail in the previous module, yes.02. Secondly, reasonable amount of physical activity, and not just the physical activity involved in everyday work, but also some time set aside for structured activity, preferably of the yogic type, done in the yogic spirit, which this course is essentially about. And thirdly, mental peace. And mental peace is often underestimated because we have a tendency to overrate physical factors like diet and exercise. In fact, the mental factors override the physical factors. And therefore, it's just as important for maintaining good immunity levels. The effects can be both acute and long-term. It has been found that one can have a change in some parameters of the immune system, which can be measured within half an hour or an hour of either a very peaceful existence or a painful existence. So that can also produce changes. And over the long term, certainly, yes, long-term effects of stress are that there's a reduction in immunocompetence. The immune system becomes less competent, less able to defend us from disease, more prone to infections, not only more prone to infections, but also more prone to cancer in the long run. Basically, it's a question of the immune system that keeps us well in spite of all the challenges from outside as well as inside, challenges which include the harmful infectious organisms.
I have this problem of hyperacidity. I get this lump in the throat, which keeps going up and down and does not allow me to sleep. Now, this does not happen always. For the last 12 days, I've been having that Nexum, the the allopathic thing, and it's okay. But if I don't have, and I have little bit of fried food, just say half a samosa or half little bit, it starts. And there's a lump in the throat which keeps going up and down. Can't sleep to right, left, or the back. What to do?
So one is maybe you produce more acid, but more than that, the acid doesn't remain confined to the stomach. The acid also has a tendency to travel upwards. Does that also produce what is called heartburn or some pain or discomfort
Lots of
above the
things. It
stomach?
has, yes, it has heartburn. More than that, sometimes the acid reflux and heartburn and this thing does not happen, but the gas goes right into my head and it squeezes the nerves so much that in the pain I get up at 2 o'clock at night or 3 o'clock because of the pain. It's like a migraine thing they do, it's to do the gas. And then I have lots of water and I walk and a lot of gas comes out from by way of burps, the car, and then it becomes okay. But it takes time and sometimes the whole day it remains. Why is this? How to, come out of it?
Well, essentially, the sort of the problem is at the junction between the food pipe and the stomach, which means that what is in the stomach doesn't stay in the stomach, especially when you lie down, then it has a tendency to travel up. That junction is not blocked.
Yeah, the splinter is open. I think so.
That
I
sphincter
think
is open. That sphincter
yeah.
is open. So
Yeah.
there are a few things that one can do. One is eat slowly, so that at least you don't swallow air along with the food. As you said that you have a feeling that air also comes up. So that air which comes up to the upper end is the air that has been swallowed with the food, and that happens when we eat too fast. So try to eat slowly, mindfully. And secondly, avoid the type of foods which give it, like say you talked about fried foods like samosa, so avoid those foods. Other foods which are generally culprits are chocolate and tea and coffee. Now these are the types of things which can increase this type of a thing. And by and large, one should be able to take care of it through this type of treatment. Mental relaxation helps all these things. So mentally at peace. In extreme situations, yes, one can also opt for surgery, but by and large, one should be able to take care of this with the conservative mechanisms. And if it happens after lying down, then an early dinner, so that you do not lie down very soon after dinner. That's again important.
Yeah,
Because
I take all these
stomach will,
precautions. I take all these precautions, but still it happens. I've started doing yoga, balasana, and Pavan Muktasan. A lot of gas comes out of that. So I've been doing yoga for 3 years. So that, but continuously I've not been. I stopped it. And so now I've started this balasana and Pavan Muktasan, toe touching. All these which release. Even Bhujangasana is very useful because it presses the stomach and the gas comes out. So I've been doing this. It's helpful. Yeah.
some of
And
the
sit on
things I have
Padma.
talked about, some of the things you have been doing in addition also. Now, all this, if you look at it, say positively, I'm sure it has helped. Your problem is not as troublesome as it was to start with. Now, the rest is that we all have some weak points in the body. And therefore, to some extent, we can deal with it. To some extent, we can learn to live with it. Both the things are important. And that's why I not said that pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. Yes, when one learns to live with it, it means that you make the suffering optional. Some difficulties remain. You can deal with them up to a point, but then when this is a weak point in my body, and it will keep troubling. But at the same time, it will not bother me anymore. I'll not suffer because of it. This not only reduces the suffering, you'll find that the problem itself starts disappearing. Because by
What I do,
concentrating attention on it too much, that itself aggravates
uh,
the problem to some
so what
extent.
I do is when I have too much of pain, then I say, oh, my soul is not suffering. It's just the body which has been given which soul is housed. That pain will come and go. That's okay. And my soul, I just keep it as a witness observing. That's okay. God is with me, given me so much better things. So it's okay. It'll pass away. And it does. So take body as a separate vehicle than the
So
soul.
there you are. I mean, you have been doing all the right things. In fact, I'm sure all of us are learning, including me, from this exchange.
And that is very humble of you to say, sir. You're so talented.
Question is, can you please suggest some books to read on the subject? I'm not from the science background. I need a little brush up.
I'll show you a few books, a few alternatives next time. But uh, for your purpose, probably the best will, without a medical background or a scientific background, will be a book for the general public that the National Book Trust has published. The book is The Human Machine, and I'll give you the details in the next session on Monday.
The next question is, mental state is the same for the entire body, but problems can manifest in just one part of the body. Why is that?
Because the different parts are made differently. And as I was saying, that we all have some weak points in the body. The stress levels may be the same, but one person gets a headache, another person gets acidity, and a third person gets heart disease. Now, those differences are because we all have different weak points in the body.
The next question is, What causes adrenal fatigue? How can one manage it through diet and yoga?
Well, I'm not sure what really adrenal fatigue is, but probably what you mean is that the type of exhaustion one feels after an adrenaline rush. Now, that adrenaline rush can be positive as well as negative. For example, an athlete who runs a 100-meter sprint also experiences an adrenaline rush. But then that doesn't make him exhausted. That gives him thrill and gives him that additional capacity for running. But if you're talking about, say, the type of what you calling adrenaline rush is the type of thing that happens when you, say, go shopping. So buying a lot of stuff can give you a certain amount of thrill. It gives happiness, but then it also leads to exhaustion. And that is because this type of thrill which comes through this type of satisfactions is releasing the neurotransmitter dopamine in the brain, and dopamine is chemically quite similar to adrenaline. So maybe that's why it can be called the adrenaline rush. Now, in contrast, the type of happiness you get, say, from giving love, by loving. Now, that doesn't release the same type of neurotransmitters. It instead releases endorphins and serotonin. And therefore, although both may be seen as two different types of happiness, the mechanisms in the brain which are operating are different. The serotonin rush and the endorphin rush gives you joy, whereas the dopamine rush gives the so-called ordinary happiness. And probably that is what also makes one feel exhausted after a while. Is that, have I been able to get to the heart of your question, or you meant something else?
I'm going to unmute myself and speak. It's the idea that the adrenal glands are overworked because you are constantly in this heightened state where they have to release cortisol all the time, and your cells kind of respond to that. Like cortisol has an evolutionary aspect where, when we lived in caves and an animal was attacking us, it helped us flee. But now with the levels of stress and things that we live in an everyday environment, whether it's work or otherwise, that level is constantly elevated, which leads to other kinds of problems in the body. That's kind of what I was trying to get at.
Yeah, so it's not just adrenaline rush. You meant adrenal rush, in particular the steroids.
Yes, that's right.
Because you have, within the adrenals, both these parts, the part that releases adrenaline in response to acute stress, and steroids, which are more related to chronic stress. And in human beings, chronic stress really becomes chronic, unlike in animals. In animals, as you said, it serves the purpose of mobilizing the resources like the carbohydrates and fats from their stores. So it serves a useful purpose in facing the emergency. But in human beings, we don't generally need that. And this mechanism, which to some extent becomes redundant, therefore, in human beings, operates in chronic stress where you do not need physical activity, but at the same time, the mechanism remains the same, and that is what creates problems. And the stress tends to be rather prolonged, unlike in animals, where it doesn't last as long as in human beings, because only human beings have that memory, because of which they may be troubled by something that happens 10 years ago, or they may be troubled by what might happen 10 years later. Only human beings do that.
Another thing I have, experienced, that you said when you love, the stress come down. I go one step ahead. When I love and do something for somebody from which I do not expect any gain. For example, a person unrelated to me, he should not be related to me, so that subconsciously also then I'll start expecting, so do something. Could not be giving money, could be giving food or teaching or helping an old person, whatever. But then you cannot get anything back from that person. Then that, when you do that nishkam seva, usse jo happiness milti hai, I think that is more long lasting than ever going to shopping or anything. And running,
absolutely.
Yeah, and running does not solve the problem. It aggravates it. You're right. Mera to acid reflux super aa jata hai,
Absolutely. There are different levels of refinement of love. Love can get more and more refined, and the more refined it is, the better it will feel.
The next question is, there are 3 questions in the same lesson. What is the origin of metabolism's theory in the human body? Then I see the consumption of food consumes the body's oxygen. So is this the use of food really necessary? And the third one is, what is the real food of the organs in the human body?
Well, I mean, one can just briefly talk about. First is metabolism. Metabolism has 2 aspects: breaking down things and manufacturing things. Both are necessary. We have to break down to release energy, and we have to manufacture for growth and repair. So all that comes under metabolism and is well regulated by the nervous and the endocrine systems. And that's how, in spite of it being a very dynamic process, we feel as if we are the same today as we were yesterday, although so much of both aspects of metabolism have taken place during this period. The second question is about consumption of food. Is it really necessary? For all practical purposes, yes. Don't look at the exceptions of those who can derive energy directly from the sun and do not, I mean, sun means S-U-N, sun, and still live. By and large, for all essential purposes, food is necessary. The third is what is the real food for the organs? The preferred fuel for most part of the body is carbohydrate, which we get in the form of glucose. But most organs can also use, when enough glucose is not available, they can break down fat and use fat as well. Some organs insist on glucose, and glucose is made available for them, like the brain. The brain utilizes only glucose. But then by and large, the preferred fuel is carbohydrate, but all the same, most organs don't insist on it.
The next question is,
One last question, please. One last question. It's really important. I was a non-vegetarian before. For the last 3 years, due to my spiritual reasons, I just left it completely. Egg also, and all other non-veg. Now, is it important because my body is feeling weak? So I feel my protein is getting less and less. So what do you suggest?
You can look up some of the class recordings of Yes.02, where we talked about the proteins. It is perfectly possible to get enough of protein, both in terms of quantity and quality, from a vegetarian diet. Okay, so this feeling may be partly psychological. You feel that I've given something which was giving me enough protein, which was essential. I've given it up, and that's why I'm feeling weak. Either it is because of that, or the cause may be something else, not the diet. So you can look up so that you can discover that it is possible to get, and at the same time, how in that the combination of cereals and pulses plays an important role. Don't think that you'll get all that protein from milk or milk products.
So
in fact, what we need is a combination of cereals and proteins. And why both are important, that again you will discover there. They have complementary proteins.
So is non-vegetarian bad for the human beings?
You see, man by biology is an omnivore. He can live on both vegetarian and non-vegetarian diets. But then man also has other aspects to his life. As you said, that for spiritual reasons I turned vegetarian. Some people are turning vegetarian for health reasons, some for ecological reasons, and some for all these 3 reasons put together. The health reasons, ecological reasons, and ethical reasons or spiritual factors. So people are turning vegetarian, and there is enough evidence to show that one can be perfectly healthy on a vegetarian diet. I mean, we talked about all these things in great detail in the previous module, and the class recordings are still there on our YouTube channel.
I think the next question, hormonal imbalance is the root cause of many diseases. How do one overcome chronic hormonal imbalance?
Well, I mean, this is a rather broad question, and generally speaking, would say that the hormones are well regulated by the nervous system. There's a close connection between the nervous system and all the vital hormones, which create these hormonal imbalances. Which means that, once again, being closely related to the higher parts of the nervous system, our thoughts and feelings influence this balance. And the 2 types of imbalances which are commonly talked about are the type of imbalance that leads to overweight, and the type of imbalance that leads to gynecological problems like polycystic ovarian disease, and so on. Now, both these types of hormonal imbalances have their root cause in the lifestyle as a whole, of which psychological factors are a major accompaniment or a major component. So once again, it goes to that thoughts and feelings influencing the hormones, or the places where the hormones are regulated, like the hypothalamus and the pituitary, and that in turn creating the imbalance.
The next question is, what is the impact of enlightenment, self-realization on the health and functioning of the various systems in the body right down to cellular level?
Well, when you're talking about the peak or the summit of the spiritual path, enlightenment and self-realization, when that happens, the person will stop bothering about all these things. They will take care of themselves. A lot of improvement will be there, but he's not bothered about it. For him, it's just a fringe benefit.
The last question, how to overcome guilt and regret for past actions?
By realizing that nobody can change the past. Sri Ravi Shankar has a beautiful take on this. I can share that with you, and maybe that probably there are no more questions that can be asked. He says that the wise man looks upon the past as destiny, looks upon the future as free will, that is, he can change the future the way he likes, and he's happy in the present. Whereas a fool looks upon the past with regret, looks at the future as destiny, and is miserable in the present. So the wise man looks upon the past not with regret, but looks upon it as destiny. You can't change it anyway. Past is history.
So there are no more questions. We can, and it's time also, we can close the session. And our next session will be on Monday, which will be an introduction